Welcome to our eCAUG presentation, Enhancing Discovery and Comics and Graphic Novels Through Secondary Resource Mapping. I'm Ken Lee, the Discovery and Systems Librarian at San Francisco State.
And my name is Christian Ward. I'm the Systems Coordinator and User Experience Analyst for California State University Sacramento Library.
The bulk of our presentation is about how to add a secondary resource type. It involves several geeky technical steps. We will talk about mishaps and the lessons learned. And we will share some examples along the way to highlight diverse titles that cover many topics in this genre. We got this assignment from the CSU Unified Library Management System Data Issues Task Force. Comics and graphic novels are increasingly popular in literature across disciplines. However, it presents pinpoint in discovery. At reference transactions, they are usually pressed for time, but there is no quick way to discover titles in this genre. And it also presents hindrance for librarians to do a targeted search in order to create comics display or a physical shelf. Since then, at San Francisco State, for example, we enabled genre field search. However, that is only in advanced search. People need to advance there first, and it's in the drop-down, so not very visible to average users. In addition to that, people need to know the correct terminology in order to be successful at finding those titles.
Okay, so before we jump into all the fun, gory details of setting up a secondary resource type, I think it's good to start with the end result to see what adding a resource type can get us and what that looks like for the end user. So in this example here, we have a secondary resource type that helps to categorize our comic graphic novels with an easier filter that allows our users to identify these material types. So here in this example, I've done a search for comic or graphic novels just to kind of give you a scope of the materials that are changed with this. And in the resource type summary on the left here, there's a new item that's checked called comics graphic novels. And when this is selected, it shows results similar to what we see here, where all the items listed are now in the comic graphic novel format. They might span multiple genres and subjects, which can be used with this in solution to provide new pathways of navigation. But you can kind of get a sense of how these items are located up into one easy to use resource type facet that then allows the user to discover more of the items. Before we leave this slide, though, I kind of want to make note of just the scale of how many records we're changing here. Last time I checked, since this is in our production environment, the last time I checked, it's growing in the number of records. So we're a little over 14,000 resources that are mapped to this facet now. And that includes all of our NZ and a few IZ records that use this rule. Next slide, please. All right, so the process of adding a secondary resource type has several steps, which we'll cover in detail in the following slides. But I wanted to just provide a quick high-level overview of the process, right? So everything starts on the left side of this flow, where we need to identify target records that need to have secondary resource types applied to them. And from that targeted record data, we need to then use that data to create mapping conditions that will target the data. In our example, we ended up using ChatGPT to help us with our regular expression creation, primarily because neither one of us is a regular expression guru, and also it seemed like a great use of the technology. Of course, we didn't take that with face value, so we used a tool called regex 101 to validate any of the mapping conditions against our targeted data. So after you've identified targeted data and created your mapping rules, the next step is to create a custom resource type with those mapping conditions. Because comics are not an out-of-the-box resource type, we have to first create one to be able to associate it as a secondary resource type. So once our custom resource type is created, we are then going to create the associating secondary resource type mapping. And there we use the same mapping conditions and associate it with the custom resource type that we made. So this is where you would associate any number of primary resources to this new resource type. Something to note, though, is that we did not want to change the primary resource type of our materials that matched the criteria. We only wanted to add a secondary resource type. We wanted to leave the original type, such as book or journal or any other material type you're selecting for here. So before we update our records, we run back to our custom resource type and we deactivate it so that it does not update those primary resource types. After we've done that, our last step is to use our target record sets and we run a job, the recalculate local resource type job. And this will update all of our records with our active secondary resource types.
So our first step is to identify target set. We started with this ALMA search. In the first row, we look for genre form contains keyword comics, asterisk. So this search has some problems. For example, the first row would include comics, criticism. However, this is not a huge issue because essentially what's being mapped is determined by the mapping condition. As long as the mapping condition is correct, only the correct records will be mapped. However, for the test purposes, we wanted to create an accurate set. So to illustrate the collections, we used this Venn diagram. By the way, the size of the circle does not represent size of the collection. So we have graphic novels and comics. Those two genres has a huge overlap. And then between these two genres and the comics criticism, they also overlap. For example, this title has both graphic novels, comics in the genre heading. And in the middle, you can also see comics criticism is also there. So this title sits at the intersection between graphic novel comics and comics criticism.
Using the Venn diagram as a guide and the genre form search index, we created multiple sets to try and gather up the records we wanted to apply a secondary resource to. We chose genre form because it indexes most of the 600 fields, which largely contains the data that we're after. And so we did try very hard to create a single set that encompassed all the records we were looking for. But in the end, it was just a little easier to create separate sets some of them overlapping, but separate sets that we could then go and just update those individual sets. So we did this by creating two separate sets for comics and graphic novels that don't contain comic criticisms. So this is our first two sets listed here, all comics that are not criticisms and all graphic novels that are not criticisms. And then we wanted to just get a final set that included all our comic criticisms, but that also were in the comic graphic novel format. So taking a look at our first set, we can see that we use genre form to identify all comic materials that don't contain comic criticisms. We chose this genre form, again, because it encompassed the data that we needed, and because other fields for identifying this data are not available in this form of set logic. Within comic graphic novel cataloging, there are several methods used to represent comic designation. One of those is using the 008 field values to determine that classification, and that's not available through set logic construction process. For that, we needed a separate method, and we will discuss that later in this presentation. Similarly, here's the logical set that we used for graphic novels. You can see it contains graphic novel sort of without criticisms. We also wanted to make sure we were only looking at published things that were in our catalog. And finally, our last set aims to get the overlap between comic criticisms and the formats of comic and graphic novels.
Now we're moving towards creating mapping condition. This is what we initially have. A straightforward, human-readable mapping condition. However, we quickly found out there are some issues with this mapping condition. Firstly, is the 6, we only identified it in 2 positions in 08. Second, we only matched uppercase, and then this also included comics criticism in 655. The lessons learned from this is we only discovered the problem after we recalculated resource type. And oops, we realized immediately we need to figure out how to clean that up. So that will be covered in a separate slides later. What we end up having is a more encompassing set of mapping conditions. There are 3 of them. The first one is the standard mark standard. So 08 at position 24 to 27 contains a 6. For the nature of content is comics, graphic novels. Since it would be much simpler if this rule was sufficient. However, out of curiosity, we ran a dual indication rule on the first set, comics, to find those titles that does not contain a 6. So sure enough, we found 47 records that does not have the 6 in 08, which is telling us just using the first rule, we will miss out some titles. So that's why we created rule 2 and rule 3. And this is where things gets complicated. Our goal is to catch all comics and graphic novels, and then also be able to handle all the incoming records. So you wanted to catch all forms of comics For example, comic strips, fantasy comics. So this include uppercase, lowercase, and sometimes comics is the first word, sometimes it's the subsequent word, sometimes they are in parentheses. So the rule 2 is to capture all the scenarios. In this process, Christian was able to extract all the genre form values from our set, so like thousands of them. And this helps to detect the pattern and for me to get all the example set here to do the test. So that's how we created the second rule. And the third rule is to compensate what's been excluded, which are comics criticism that are also written as comics or graphic novels. So the third rule was able to add those back. So we end up with this rule 2 and rule 3, the gibberish general expression. I wanted to point out, if there's one thing you take away today is don't use unverified regex. So ChatGPT created those regex, and I used a tool called regex101.com to verify if those are actually doing what we wanted to do. So how to use this is you put the regex in the top box and then put data you want to test with in the box below, and whatever matches will be highlighted. So the second rule here clearly shows that all forms of comics are matched because they're highlighted. And what's not highlighted are those phrases that include comics criticism. And then using the same data values, applying rule 3 in the verification, then all the comics criticism was added back, except the first two, because the first two does not have comics or graphic novel genre form terms. So this verified tool, rule 2 and rule 3 in combination was able to successfully match what we wanted to match and not match what we don't want it to match. Voila. So I have an example here. No, that's one. A caveat is when observing the result on the user interface, this title did not tell us this is comics and graphic novels. However, it's easy to see it as just a comics criticism. That is because at CSU, our normalization rule does not normalize fast heading into display. So it actually has this graphic novels in genre form term 655, but it's just not showing on the record. So that's a caveat. Second is this rule is not going to capture everything. This is a comics journal, and in 6055, it does not have the term we identified. However, manga is a subgenre of comics. It's Japanese comics, and manhwa is Korean comics. So they are comics books or journals. If the metadata does not have it, it's not going to match. So for this journal, a cataloger at SDSU was able to inform us, and we manually added this back to the set. However, this would not be an issue when the system do a system-wide recalculation, because this title does have 6 in '08. So eventually it's going to capture this title in the facet. And some quick notes about using ChatGPT. Here is some of my tips I wanted to share with you. First, apparently just tell it to match all comics, graphic novels is not going to work. You need to clearly, with details, describe the character string you want it to match. And in addition to description, it's helpful to provide it with examples. And ask it to repeat back to you what the regex does. And for me, it's during this process, I found it's actually it's misinterpreted my instruction and was not doing what I wanted to do. And also verified in a different chat box. Ask that chat box what this regex does. Like all things AI does, don't use it without verification. The same as human generated regex, don't use it until you verified it. And recognize its limit. So for me, I started to create one regex and it's not doing what I wanted to achieve. So I end up breaking it down into two different regex. And in combination, use a or, this is able to do what I wanted it to do. Okay, I'll fast forward to Christian.
Okay, so now that we have identified records and we created our mapping conditions from those records, the next step is and we verified those conditions. The next step is to create a local resource type that will be used to map a secondary resource type to our targeted records. To do this, we need to first start with creating a custom resource type. This is pretty straightforward. You give it a unique code and the required display labels. I will say, though, if you are living in a consortia environment, you really want to pay attention to the code that you use and make sure that at the NZ level and the IZ level, if you have IZ only records that match these secondary resource type conditions, this will need to be applied at the IZ level as well. And to make those facets line up and all be contained in the same comic graphic novels facet, you need to make sure that the code is the same across both the IZ setup and the NZ setup. So the mapping conditions that we created with ChatGPT and verified with regex 101 are then applied to our local resource type, and we put those directly into this mapping. And we also click the active button. We need this active in order to see it in the list of secondary resource types so that we can do that mapping in the next step. But it's important to note that we only activate this new custom resource type during the secondary resource type creation. Once the secondary resource type mapping is done, we need to come back here and deactivate the local resource type so that the primary resource types on our materials stay exactly as they are intended to be. In this case, we wanted just books and journals. If we left the custom resource type enabled and then we updated all of our comic graphic novel target records with this, it would change them to be of type comic and graphic novel, and that's not what we wanted. So we'll come back to this step in a minute and we'll deactivate it. Okay, so next step, now that we've set up our our local custom resource, now it's time to actually set up our secondary resource type. We do this by assigning a main resource type with our newly created custom resource type. Here in this example, you can see that we're mapping books to our custom comic and graphic novels resource type. In our production instance of this, we also included journals in our main resource type mapping. Again, the mapping conditions are the same as they were for the custom resource type, but we also discovered that we needed a Dublin core mapping to ensure that records get updated correctly. This is an undocumented part of the system, and Ex Libris was able to assist us with this information through a couple open cases that we had with them. But the reason being is that if you are importing Dublin core data into Alma and you use rules to do that, and you have secondary resource types defined, there's a bit of an anomaly here that if you don't supply a mapping condition for Dublin core, that your local data will just automatically have this secondary resource type applied to it. Um, which is probably not what you want, unless, of course, you're bringing in comic graphic novel data through Dublin Core in some reason. And then you would supply a mapping condition in the same format or similar format as the Mark 21. So once this mapping is in place, though, and the secondary resource type is saved, I should mention. So the way that you get around this for the Dublin core, just to prevent any overmatching and overwriting of this, is that you just provided a sort of dummy value to check against, and you make sure this value isn't found anywhere in your metadata. So Ex Libris suggested that we add a single value for DC type, and we set it to the value of dummy type. This will not be found in any of your metadata that you're bringing in through Dublin Core import profiles, so it will not match on any of that. And that data will just be skipped. So once the mapping is in place and secondary resource type is saved, we have to run back to the local resource type, and we deactivate the custom local resource type to ensure that their intended primary resource types stay the same. Okay, so we are almost ready to do everything. We created our secondary resource type. We ran back and deactivated the custom comic local resource type. And at that point, we started updating records with the new rules that we put in place. We got together virtually over 3 sessions that spanned a few months. Each session was a few hours long. And then we would work outside of those sessions on any areas that needed adjustment. During those sessions, though, we worked on small sets, 1 or 2 records, and we tested our secondary resource type assignment. When we were comfortable with the assignment and that things were matching and applying the way we wanted to, we moved to updating the larger sets of comics, graphic novels, and criticisms in the comic graphic novel format by using our target record sets. And we learned some things along the way here. So the first thing we noticed is that records did not immediately appear updated on the discovery side of things. This is due to another undocumented aspect, or perhaps a minimally documented aspect, and that is that when you are adding new metadata to a record or removing metadata from a record in Primo VE, there's a 15-minute delay for indexing. If you're changing data that's already in the record and you're changing the way it displays, that is immediately visible. But when you're adding or taking away metadata, it needs time to index that data. So that's the first thing we learned. The second thing is, because we did this over several months and a few sessions, it was really important that we knew what we did the previous time so that we could just take off from where we last were. And so we just started documenting everything that we were doing in the process. I would recommend that anybody thinking about implementing this does the same, because it may be months or even years when you come back to this to try and understand what you did, and having some documentation will really help out that overall process. We also are a part of a task force that is looking at this for all the CSUs. And so we knew that we were going to need to provide full documentation for how this process was set up for the next people that are on this task force. The other thing that we needed to consider is that we live in a consortia, the CSUs do, so as well as many others do, and we have many records in common, which are going to be in our NZ, and updating those will update it for everybody that has the common records activated in their system. But some institutions have local only collections that also meet this criteria. So if you want those to be a part of this resource type facet, then you need to do the same exact process, but just do it in your IZ. So you have to identify your target records and create mapping conditions. Luckily, you can use the mapping conditions defined in this presentation, but you'll still have to go through all these steps and set up a custom local resource type and a secondary resource type and update your records. So as we hinted after our first initial go at this, we realized very quickly that we overmatched on far too many records, and that we were seeing records that didn't meet the criteria of being a comic graphic novel, but were caught in our sets. So wow, the freak out moment is, okay, wait, where's the undo button? Like how do we undo what we just did? Because we updated a lot of records. And unfortunately, the major takeaway that we learned is that there is no undo button. There's a process you can do to remove data that's already been added to a record, but there's no quick undo button that says, oh my gosh, undo what I just did to these, tens of thousands of records. So the process is sort of outlined here. If you suspect that you have overmatched, we recommend that you immediately go and undo those, try and remove that data, because it will be harder to identify them as you keep changing data down the road. So the first thing you're going to do, see, we have to understand a little bit about how things are being updated. There's a job that runs to update your records, the recalculate local resource type job. And what this does is it sort of starts by looking at all the local resource types and secondary resource types, kind of contrary to what the job name says. It also includes secondary resource types. And it looks at all the rules you have defined, and then it tries and updates that bit of data as it runs through each of those rules. So even if you deactivate a rule, a secondary resource type is what I mean. If you deactivate it, that's not enough to remove the data, because this job will look at those secondary resource types and say, oh, it's deactivated. I'm just going to skip this. I won't do anything with the data. So if you've already added data, it's not going to remove it. The way to remove it is that you have to remove the secondary resource type and the custom local resource type. You have to physically delete them from your system so that they don't exist in your tables for secondary resource types. And then you run your recalculate job. And in that process, the system understands that it identifies metadata in the record, but there's no associated local resource type or secondary resource type that matches or has some sort of rule for that data. And that is the indicator that causes the system to remove the metadata that was in the record. So you have to delete these two things, rerun the job, that will remove the data, and then you can then create a new custom local resource type and a secondary resource type with all your mapping conditions. So you have to recreate it afterwards to update it with something new. And of course, along the way, you have to wait 15 minutes to review your changes. But after your 15 minutes, those records should no longer have that data associated with them.
So we were successful in clearing that up and creating this new facet. after the project was completed, we were thinking about how to improve. So a few things we wanted to, in our first set, we only identified books with the ISBN, and we need to add books that actually does not have ISBN too. In our system, we have like thousands of them. And you may also notice that genre phone turn is indexed by multiple 600 field, and we only use the 6055. So next step, we're going to identify what kind of records are left out and how to find those records within the limit of 5 mapping conditions. So we're happy to provide very limited resources here. As the saying goes, when documentation ends is when the system job person's work begins. And if you are the kind of person who likes to organize things, this is the type of project for you. Thank you for listening to our presentation.